A billionaire handed a broke single father 5 destroyed motorcycles and told him, in front of a room full of laughing executives, to go make money from the junk or stop wasting her time. She expected him to walk away humiliated. He did walk away, but he didn't walk away broken. And what he built in a leaking garage with nothing but those 5 wrecks and a daughter who believed in him would eventually force the woman who laughed the loudest to come back. Not to mock him, but to beg for a seat at the table he built from her scraps. If you've ever been dismissed, underestimated, or handed someone's leftovers like they were doing you a favor, this story is for you. Hit the like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The Tuesday morning, Owen Carter drove his truck into the city. The exhaust pipe was held on with a section of wire coat hanger and a prayer, and he knew it. He could hear it rattling underneath him every time he hit a pothole, which in this part of downtown was roughly every 40 feet. The heater hadn't worked since November. His daughter Lily had drawn a sun on the fogged-up passenger window with her finger on the last morning he dropped her off at school, and the smudge of it was still there on the glass beside him. He hadn't wiped it off. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because it was the most cheerful thing in the cab. He'd been up since 4, not because he'd planned to be, but because that was the hour when the silence in the house got loud enough to wake him. The particular kind of silence that follows a person around for years after they've lost someone and still haven't figured out how to fill the space properly. He'd made coffee, checked his phone for messages that weren't there, and sat at the kitchen table for 20 minutes staring at a stack of bills he'd already opened and couldn't pay. Then he'd put on his cleanest shirt, which had a small grease stain near the second button that he'd tried to cover with a jacket, loaded a folder of work photographs into the passenger seat, and driven into the city. He had an appointment, or something close to one. 3 weeks earlier, Owen had sent a letter, an actual printed letter, because the company's website contact form kept kicking back errors, to the corporate office of Sinclair Motor Works, the most recognizable luxury motorcycle brand in the country. He'd included 6 photographs of restoration work he'd done over the past year, a 1974 Triumph that a guy in Davenport had dragged out of his barn, a pair of old BSAs he'd bought at an estate sale for less than the cost of a decent dinner, a couple of Japanese machines with frames bent badly enough that most shops would have parted them out immediately. Owen had fixed them all. Not just fixed, rebuilt. Each one ran better than it had from the factory, and the 2 BSAs he'd sold for enough money to keep the lights on through the winter. The letter got a response, but not really the kind he'd hoped for. A junior HR coordinator named, according to the email signature, Priya Mehta, had written back to say that while Sinclair Motorworks appreciated his interest, they were not currently hiring floor technicians, but that if he wanted to visit their downtown headquarters during business hours, he was welcome to drop off a formal application, which would be reviewed in the order it was received. That was it. That was the whole thing. Owen had read the email twice, then called the number at the bottom of it. Priya Mehta had answered on the 4th ring and confirmed, with the careful politeness of someone trained to say no without actually saying no, that there was no open position at the moment, but he was absolutely welcome to bring something in. Owen had thanked her. He'd hung up and looked at the bills on the table again. Then he'd gone to the garage and worked until midnight because he didn't know what else to do with himself. The thing about Owen Carter that most people didn't understand, and most people didn't bother trying to understand because Owen Carter was not a man who broadcast his situation, was that he was genuinely, technically excellent at what he did. This wasn't pride talking. He had no particular talent for pride anymore. His wife Maya had been the one who could make him feel good about himself with a few well-placed words at the right moment, and Maya had been gone for almost 4 years. What Owen had, stripped of the comfort of someone else's belief in him, was the plain and unromantic fact that he understood machines in a way that was difficult to explain. He could hear problems. He could hold a carburetor in his hands and know from the feel of it what was wrong before he'd taken it apart. He'd been doing this since he was 14, watching his uncle work in a garage outside of Rockford, and he'd gotten better every single year since. His shop, the one he'd run with Maya, had been successful enough. Not flashy, not the kind of place that attracted magazine coverage or Instagram followers. Just a solid neighborhood shop with a growing list of loyal customers who came back because Owen fixed things right the first time and didn't overcharge them for it. They'd been building towards something, he and Maya. Nothing huge, just sustainable, just a life. Then she got sick, and everything that had been building toward something started building toward nothing instead. He'd kept the shop open for 8 months after she died, running it alone, getting Lily to school each morning and picking her up in the afternoons, trying to hold the whole thing together with a determination that looked a lot like denial. The shop had failed anyway. Not dramatically. No single disaster. No flood. No fire. Just the slow, grinding arithmetic of too many expenses and not enough revenue, and a grief-hollowed man making decisions that were slightly worse than they needed to be, slightly too often, for slightly too long. He'd sold the space 18 months ago, the tools he kept. He was still working out of a rented garage near his rental house, the kind of place that technically had roof but had apparently never heard of insulation, and when it rained heavily enough, water came through a seam near the back corner and pooled on the concrete floor. He put a bucket under it. The bucket had been there so long, it had become furniture. Sinclair Motor Works occupied 7 floors of a glass building in the Lakeview district that looked expensive enough to charge admission. Owen found parking 3 blocks away because the nearby garage wanted $12 an hour, and he didn't have $12 an hour to spare. He walked the 3 blocks in the November cold, checked that the grease stain on his shirt was still hidden, and pushed through the revolving door into the lobby. The lobby was warm and enormous and smelled faintly of money, that particular scent that expensive places have, some combination of leather and climate control, and surfaces that have never once gone unpolished. A display case along one wall held 3 motorcycles that Owen recognized as flagship models from the Sinclair line, machines that retailed for north of $40,000 apiece. He paused in front of one, a Sinclair Vanguard 512 in matte black, and looked at it with the specific attention he gave to anything mechanical. Beautiful engineering, overpriced but beautiful. The receptionist was a young man in a dark suit who managed to convey through no particular rudeness that Owen was not exactly the typical visitor to this lobby. "Owen Carter," Owen said. "I have a letter. I spoke with Priya Mehta in HR." The young man made a call. There was a wait of about 15 minutes, during which Owen sat in a chair that cost more than his monthly rent and tried not to look like he was thinking about how much the chair cost. He looked at his photographs instead, going through them in the folder, checking that they were in the order he'd arranged them. Priya Mehta was younger than he'd expected, mid-20s, brisk, and kind in the way that people are kind when they've been trained to be kind to visitors who aren't going to get what they came for. She brought him to a small conference room on the 3rd floor with floor-to-ceiling windows and a table that could seat 20. Owen sat on one side. Priya sat across from him and opened a notepad. "So, Mr. Carter, tell me about the kind of work you're looking for." He told her. He explained the restorations, the custom engineering, the performance rebuilds. He slid the photographs across the table and watched her look at them. She had the face of someone who found them genuinely impressive, but wasn't quite sure what to do with that impression in the context of her job. "These are remarkable," she said, which Owen appreciated for being true. "The challenge is that our floor positions are all union, and we're currently at capacity. What you do is more artisan level, which isn't really what our production lines require." "I know," Owen said. "I'm not looking to work an assembly line. I'm looking for a custom development role. Product R&D. Your Vanguard line, the rear suspension geometry has a design flaw that creates instability above 90 miles an hour. I could show you what I'd change and why." Priya looked at him for a moment. Then she said, carefully, "Let me see if Ms. Sinclair is available." He hadn't expected that. He also hadn't expected to be kept waiting for another 40 minutes, during which time he ate a granola bar from his jacket pocket and looked out the window at the city and thought about Lily, who was at school right now, probably fine, probably eating lunch with her friends. She was a good kid, better than he deserved, or at least better than the version of himself that existed lately. She had Maya's eyes and his stubbornness, and some third quality that was entirely her own. A kind of practical, cheerful toughness that Owen couldn't quite account for. He was still thinking about her when the door opened. Vanessa Sinclair was not what he'd pictured. He'd looked her up, of course. There were photographs of her at industry events, at charity galas, in the kind of business magazine profiles that describe CEOs as visionary and relentless and redefining an industry before the interview has really started. Photographs made her look polished and somewhat remote, the way powerful people often look in staged images. In person, she was more interesting than that. She was 32 years old and moved like someone who had never once been uncertain about whether she deserved to be in a room. Not arrogant exactly, or not only arrogant, more like a person who had been told for so long that she was exceptional that the information had become structural, like load-bearing wall. She came in with two other people, a man in an expensive suit who was clearly some kind of senior executive, and a woman with a tablet who was clearly his counterpart. Neither of them looked at Owen with anything except the polite neutrality of people waiting to see how something plays out. Vanessa looked at him directly. She looked at the photographs on the table. She looked back at him. "Owen Carter," she said. She had a voice that was used to carrying rooms. "Priya tells me you have an opinion about our Vanguard suspension." "I do," Owen said. "Interesting." She sat down. She didn't open the photographs. "What kind of shop did you run?" He told her. "The whole thing. The shop he and Maya had built, the closure, the rented garage, the restoration work since." "And you drove in from where?" "Hollow Creek, about 40 miles out." "Hmm?" She picked up one of the photographs and looked at it. The BSA. Owen watched her face and couldn't read it. "These are old machines." "Old machines teach you things that new ones don't," Owen said. "And your current facility?" "A rented garage, about 1,200 square feet." Something shifted in her face so briefly he might have imagined it. Amusement, maybe. Not warm amusement. "What do you charge for a restoration?" He told her his rates. He could see from the expression of the man in the expensive suit that the numbers were low enough to be either impressive or depressing, depending on your perspective. Vanessa simply nodded slowly, the way you nod when someone confirms a thing you'd already suspected. "Let me be straightforward with you, Mr. Carter," she said, and her tone was businesslike, but there was something underneath it, an edge that hadn't been there at the start. "What you do is impressive for what it is. But what it is, artisan restoration of vintage machines in a 1,200 square foot garage, isn't something that has an application in our business model. We operate at a scale that requires systems, not craftsmanship." "Your suspension flaw affects rider safety at highway speeds," Owen said. He kept his voice level. "That's not a system problem. That's an engineering problem. And it's the kind of problem I can help with." Vanessa looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the man beside her, and something passed between them. A shared glance that carried a private joke, and Owen felt it land in his chest like a cold drop of water. "Tell me something," she said, and now her voice had taken on a quality that was too casual, too light, like someone reaching for something while pretending not to. "What would you say is the foundational skill of a businessman, or businesswoman, in my case?" "Identifying value where others don't see it," Owen said. She smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. "I'd say it's knowing what's worth your time and what isn't." She stood up, and both of her associates stood with her, and Owen understood that the meeting was over. He began to gather his photographs. "Wait," Vanessa said. He stopped. She was looking out the window, down toward the street below, with an expression he couldn't read. Then she turned back to him, and the amusement was fully there now, settled in like something comfortable. "Priya," she said, "what's sitting in the east loading bay right now?" Priya looked up from her tablet with the expression of someone who hadn't expected the meeting to go this direction. The decommissioned units, the 5 from the Morrow Estate auction, they were supposed to go to the scrapper last week, but the pickup got rescheduled." "Have someone bring them up front," Vanessa said. Then she looked at Owen. "Mr. Carter, you say you can find value where others can't." He didn't say anything. He waited. "I have 5 motorcycles in the bay downstairs," she said. "They came from an estate auction 8 months ago. We bought the lot for parts, used what we needed, and the rest—" She gestured with one hand, a small, dismissive gesture. "Worthless, scrap metal, basically. Priya, what would the scrapper give us for them?" Priya checked her tablet. The quote was $80 for the lot. $80, Vanessa repeated, and the man beside her made a sound that was almost a laugh. Almost. "Mr. Carter, if you can take those 5 motorcycles and turn a profit from them, not just fix them, but actually build a viable business from the worst junk we own, come back and teach me business." She was smiling openly now. "I'll have someone load them into whatever you drove here. Consider it a gift." The room was quiet for a moment, and then the man beside Vanessa said something under his breath to Priya, and Priya made a sound that tried very hard not to be a laugh. Owen looked at each of them in turn. He looked at Vanessa Sinclair, who was still smiling with the comfortable certainty of someone who has just done something entertaining. He picked up his folder. He put the photographs back inside it, one by one, methodically. "I'll need someone to help me get them to the trailer," he said. Vanessa blinked. Something moved across her face. Not quite surprise, but the first cousin of it. "Excuse me?" "The motorcycles. I'll need someone to help me get them to my trailer. I drove a 3/4-ton truck. It's parked on Whitmore Street." He zipped the folder shut. "And I'll need a receipt showing ownership transfer. I don't want any issues with title later." The room was very quiet. Vanessa Sinclair looked at Owen Carter for a long moment with an expression that he would remember later as the first time in that interaction he'd felt like she was actually seeing him. Not the worn jacket, not the grease-stained shirt. Him. Then she said to Priya, "Get him his paperwork." She left the room without looking back. Owen heard her say something to the man in the expensive suit in the hallway, their voices low. He heard a short sound of laughter, and then that was gone too, fading around a corner. He sat for a moment in the empty conference room, in the expensive chair with the photographs of his work on the table in front of him. He put the folder under his arm and went to find a loading dock. The 5 motorcycles were, by any reasonable standard, a disaster. The Sinclair employee who helped him get them to the truck, a young guy named Marcus, who seemed genuinely uncertain whether he was supposed to be sorry about this or not, apologized twice without actually saying what he was apologizing for, which was its own kind of communication. Owen walked around each machine before they loaded it, and he did this slowly, and Marcus watched him with the look of someone expecting a person to get angry and not quite understanding why they weren't. 2 were Sinclair Imperials from a decade back, machines that had once retailed for $35,000 apiece and were now bent, corroded, and missing components. One had clearly been in a significant accident. The frame was cracked at the steering head in a way that most people would have written off immediately. The other 4 were a mixed lot, an old British twin that had been sitting somewhere damp for what looked like years, another Japanese machine with a seized engine and a wiring harness that had been partially stripped and then abandoned, and a 5th one, barely recognizable as a motorcycle, that was essentially a rolling collection of rust held together by surface tension and what appeared to be several years' worth of accumulated grime. Marcus started to say something apologetic in general, and Owen held up one hand to stop him. "I need some cardboard," Owen said, "to wrap the chrome pieces so they don't scratch each other in transit." Marcus went and found cardboard. They loaded the machines onto the trailer with a ramp and 2x4s that Owen kept in the truck bed for exactly this kind of situation. He strapped everything down with the ratchet straps he'd brought, which he'd brought because he'd been in this business long enough to know that you always bring your own ratchet straps. Then he signed the ownership transfer that Priya Mehta had sent down by email and had Marcus sign as a witness. "You sure about this?" Marcus said, not unkindly. "Yeah," Owen said. "Those things are pretty—" Marcus paused, searching for the word. "Done." "I know what they are," Owen said. He drove out of the Sinclair Motorworks loading area and back through the Lakeview district and onto the highway toward Hallow Creek. The rattle from the exhaust pipe was worse than it had been this morning. One of the rear tires was getting low. The heater still didn't work. Through the windshield, the city thinned out and gave way to flat November country. Bare cornfields, farmhouses with lights on, stretches of gray road that went on longer than you wanted them to. Owen drove in silence. He didn't turn on the radio. He was thinking, and when he was really thinking, music was interference. He was thinking about the Sinclair Imperial with the cracked steering head. He was thinking about the seized Japanese engine and what the seizure pattern would tell him about what had killed it. He was thinking about the British twin and whether the frame was original and whether it had any kind of collectible value that the Sinclair people hadn't bothered to identify. He was thinking about the 5th machine, the one that was barely there. And he was thinking that sometimes the most damaged thing in the room is the one with the most interesting history. He was also thinking about Vanessa Sinclair standing in that conference room with that smile, and the sound of the executive's muffled laugh, and the quality of silence after he'd said he'd need help getting the motorcycles to his trailer. He let himself think about those things for a while, and then he put them in a compartment and closed it, because they weren't useful. Anger wasn't useful. Embarrassment wasn't useful. What was useful was the rattle from the exhaust pipe, which he already knew how to fix, and 5 broken motorcycles on a trailer behind him, which he was beginning to understand how to fix as well. He stopped at the school at 3:15. Lily came out in her orange coat with her backpack bouncing and her hair in a ponytail that was coming loose on one side, and she ran the last 10 feet to the truck with the natural full-speed enthusiasm of an 8-year-old who hadn't yet learned to modulate her arrivals. She climbed in and looked at the trailer through the rear window. "Are those motorcycles?" "They are." She looked at them for a moment. "They look terrible." "They are terrible," Owen said. "Put your seatbelt on." She put her seatbelt on. She looked at the motorcycles again, then at her father. "Did you get the job?" A pause. Long enough that she heard the answer in it before he gave one. "Not exactly," he said. She was quiet for a moment. She was 8, but she was not, had never been, a child who required complicated information to be softened into uselessness. She looked at him directly with those brown eyes that were so much like her mother's that looking directly back sometimes still cost him something. "So where did the motorcycles come from?" "The lady who owns the company gave them to me." "Gave them? Why?" He thought about how to answer that. "She thought they were worthless," he said finally. "She thought it was funny." Lily looked at the 5 wrecks on the trailer again. She pulled her loose ponytail out and redid it, a habit she had when she was thinking. "Are they worthless?" she said. "No," Owen said. She considered this. Then she said, "People laugh at things they don't understand, with the specific confidence of someone stating a thing that simply is, the way you state that water is wet, or that Tuesday follows Monday." He looked at her. "Mrs. Branning said that," Lily said, "about when Jalen laughed at Marcus's art project." "Mrs. Branning's right," Owen said. They drove the rest of the way home with the radio off, and Lily telling him about a disagreement at lunch that had been resolved through the strategic redistribution of chocolate pudding, and Owen listened to all of it and asked the right questions. When they got home, he made pasta for dinner and helped her with a worksheet on fractions that he found more annoying than he expected, and watched half an episode of her current favorite show before she fell asleep on the couch, and he carried her to bed. Then he went to the garage. He turned on every light he had, which was a shop light he'd mounted to the ceiling, 2 clip-on work lights attached to the shelving, and a trouble light on a cord that he moved around as needed. He pulled the first motorcycle, the British twin, off the trailer and got it up on the lift. He put on his headlamp. He opened his notebook to the first blank page. He began to go through it systematically, writing notes in the compressed, practical shorthand he'd developed over 20 years. Frame condition, fork tubes, engine cases, primary cover, gearbox, wheels. He went slow. He made himself see what was actually there rather than what he'd already decided was there, which was the most important discipline in this kind of work, and the hardest one to maintain. He worked until 2 in the morning. He covered the machines with tarps when he was done, turned off the lights, and stood in the dark doorway of the garage for a moment looking at the covered shapes on the floor. He thought about what Vanessa Sinclair had said. "If you can make money from this junk, come back and teach me business." He thought about her smile, the laugh from behind the closed door. He went inside. He slept for 4 hours. He got up and made coffee and went back out to the garage before Lily was awake. He already knew what he was going to do. The shape of it had come to him somewhere around midnight. Not suddenly, not in a flash, but gradually. The way the answer to a mechanical problem comes when you stop forcing it and let your hands and your brain work together without supervision. He wasn't going to restore these motorcycles. Restoration was returning something to what it had been. These machines, even the ones with some collectible value, had been written off, discarded, sent to the end of their story. Putting them back the way they were was just postponing the same conclusion. He was going to do something different. He was going to take what was genuinely good in each one, the components that had actual life left in them, the design elements that had value, the mechanical DNA that was worth preserving, and he was going to engineer something new, not replicas, not restorations, something that didn't exist yet. Machines built around a philosophy of using what was real instead of pretending something was worth more or less than it was. He knew how to do this. He'd been circling it for 2 years in the rented garage, in the work he'd done on the BS6s and the Triumph and the others, without quite naming it. Now, he was naming it. He pulled the tarp off the British twin and got to work. The cold got worse through November. He wore 2 jackets in the garage and fingerless gloves when he needed the dexterity, and regular gloves when he didn't. The bucket in the corner caught water twice during heavy rain. He bought a second bucket at the dollar store and positioned it 6 inches to the left, where the overflow sometimes ran when the primary bucket filled. He kept detailed notes. Every decision he made, why he chose to retain a particular component versus source a replacement, how he modified a frame junction to improve stress distribution, what he'd changed about the carburation setup, and why, went into the notebook. He was thinking about more than just these 5 machines. He was thinking about a system, a method, something reproducible. Lily had homework and he helped with it every night. She had a school project about ecosystems, and he found himself genuinely interested in the food chain diagrams, which surprised him. She went through phases of worrying about him. He could see it in the way she sometimes watched him when she thought he wasn't looking. The small frown between her eyebrows that was his own expression wearing her face. When this happened, he found ways to make her laugh, because her laugh was the specific sound of something still intact in his life, and he needed to hear it regularly. He began posting on social media in December. He'd resisted this for a long time, because it felt like performing rather than working. And Owen was not a performer. But Marcus from the Sinclair loading dock had suggested it. Marcus had apparently told his sister about the interaction at the loading bay, and his sister had asked if Owen had any photos of the bikes online, and when she found out he didn't, she'd apparently said something along the lines of, "That's just leaving money on the table," which was the kind of statement that, once you heard it, stayed with you. He started simply. Photographs from his phone. The British twin in various stages of disassembly. The tangle of old wiring, the gummed-up carburetor, the corroded but structurally sound frame after he'd cleaned it down to bare metal. A short video of the seized Japanese engine turning over for the first time after he'd broken it down, flushed the oil galleries, machined the cylinder wall, and reassembled it with an attention to tolerances that the original factory had never bothered with. He wrote short, direct captions explaining what he was doing and why. The first video got 11 views, the second got 40. He posted a comparison photograph of the cracked Sinclair Imperial frame, showing the crack at the steering head, and then showing the sleeve repair he'd engineered and welded around it, with measurements demonstrating that the repair was structurally superior to the original design in that specific location. And that post got 400 views in 3 days, most of them from people in motorcycle forums arguing about whether the repair was legitimate. Owen responded to the arguments with engineering citations, and did not respond to anything else. The fourth video, the British twin running for the first time, which was a raw clip shot from his phone propped against a toolbox, the engine doing exactly what it was supposed to do with a clean, specific note that sounded nothing like a machine that had been a write-off 4 months earlier, got 3,000 views before he woke up the next morning. By February, one of Owen's videos had been shared into a large custom motorcycle community online and had accumulated enough attention that 2 riders had driven to Hallow Creek specifically to find the garage. He didn't have a sign out front. They found it because one of them had figured out the approximate location from the street view visible in a background shot in one of his videos, which was either impressive or slightly alarming, and Owen wasn't sure which. He sold the British twin on a Thursday afternoon to a man named Garrett, who had ridden up from Tennessee on his own machine and who spent 45 minutes going over every inch of Owen's work before taking it out for a 30-minute test ride. When Garrett came back, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I've owned 12 motorcycles. This is the best riding one I've ever been on." Owen told him the price. Garrett paid without negotiating. Standing in the garage after Garrett's taillights disappeared down the street, Owen did the math on the British twin. He'd bought it, technically been given it, as part of a lot that cost him nothing. He'd spent $400 on parts. He'd sold it for $8,000. He stood there for a while doing and redoing this calculation, not because he didn't trust the result, but because he found it useful to sit inside the reality of it for a moment. Then he went inside and made Lily's lunch for the next day and went to bed at 11, which was early for him lately. He was back in the garage by 4:30. By March, Owen had sold 3 of the 5 motorcycles. The proceeds had cleared his overdue bills, covered 2 months of rent in advance, and for the first time in longer than he wanted to count, left him with a balance in his account that didn't require him to do arithmetic before buying groceries. He reinvested most of it: a better welder, a parts washer, a used lathe that he'd found through an estate sale that required a full day's work to get running, but was, once running, worth 3 times what he'd paid. He put a better light fixture in the garage and fixed the roof seam himself with a tube of commercial sealant and 2 hours on a ladder in the rain, which was miserable but solved the bucket problem. The 2 remaining machines, the worst of the lot, the 5th motorcycle that was barely there, and the cracked Imperial he'd saved for last because it was the most complex, were still on the lift. He was taking his time with them. The 5th machine, the one that had seemed like scrap metal and surface tension, had revealed itself during teardown as a rarer model than he'd expected. A limited production machine from the late 1970s that had been so thoroughly neglected that nobody had recognized it, including, apparently, anyone at Sinclair Motor Works. He'd spent 3 weeks tracking down appropriate components and cross-referencing period documentation before he touched anything structural. His social media following had grown enough that when he posted about what the 5th machine actually was, the response came from people who knew exactly what it was and understood exactly why this mattered. There were offers to buy it, sight unseen, before it was even close to finished. Owen declined all of them. He wasn't ready to name a price yet, and he had learned from years of working on machines that other people had misjudged, not to put a number on something before you fully understood what it was. He was in the garage on a Saturday evening in March, working on the Imperial's electrical system, when his phone showed a notification from the social media account. He was used to ignoring these while he worked, but the name caught his eye. Someone who had, apparently, shared his British twin video to their own account with a large following, a writer and content creator named Del Fontaine, who Owen had vaguely heard of, had tagged Owen with a caption that said something along the lines of, "If you're in the Midwest and you care about how motorcycles are actually supposed to feel, you need to find this man." By morning, Owen's follower count had more than quadrupled. Lily noticed at breakfast. She was looking at his phone while he made eggs. "Dad, people are saying really nice things about you." "Put the phone down while we eat." She put the phone down. Then she said, "There are people asking where your shop is." "I know." "Do you have a shop? Like an official one?" "I have a garage." She was quiet while he served the eggs. Then, "Maybe you should have a sign." He thought about that. He thought about the leaking garage and the 2-bucket system that no longer leaked, and the loan he'd never quite managed to pay off before the shop closed, and the look on Vanessa Sinclair's face when he'd told her about the 1,200 square feet. He thought about the notebook with its 50-some pages of engineering notes that was starting to feel like something more than personal documentation. "Maybe," he said. She ate her eggs. She looked at him with Maya's eyes and his stubbornness. "People laugh at things they don't understand," she said again. He looked at her. "I know," he said. "I know they do." He got up and cleared the plates and washed them at the sink, and through the window he could see the garage door, and behind it the covered shapes of the 2 remaining machines. The Imperial, the rare one, both of them waiting. He dried his hands. He went out to the garage. He had work to do. The sign was Lily's idea, but the lettering was Owen's. He cut it from a piece of sheet aluminum he had left over from a fender repair, ground the edges smooth, and stenciled the letters himself with a paint pen in flat black, Carter Custom. Below that, smaller, Restoration and Engineering. He drilled 2 holes at the top and hung it from a hook above the garage door on a Sunday afternoon in late March, while Lily stood on the driveway giving him directions about whether it was level, which it wasn't, twice, before it finally was. She stood back and looked at it with her arms crossed the way she crossed them when she was assessing something seriously. "It's good," she said. "It's a sign." "It's a good sign." She uncrossed her arms. "Can I paint something on it?" "No." "A small thing?" "No." She went inside unoffended. Owen stood in the driveway a moment longer looking at the sign himself. Carter Custom. 2 words. It looked real. That surprised him slightly. Not that he doubted his own work, but that the gap between the thing you're building and the thing that actually exists can feel enormous right up until the moment it doesn't, and then it just looks like a sign above a garage door on a street in Hallow Creek. He went inside and made dinner. The following week brought 4 new inquiries through the social media account, 2 of which were serious enough that Owen spent time on the phone with the people behind them. One was a collector in Ohio named Paul Strickland, who had a 1969 Bonneville that he'd been trying to find someone to rebuild for 3 years, and hadn't trusted anyone enough to hand it over. The other was a younger guy, maybe mid-20s, who had bought a crashed machine cheap and wanted it transformed rather than just repaired. Owen took both jobs. The Bonneville arrived on a flatbed the following Thursday, and even under the surface grime and the amateur repairs someone had done to the carburation, at some point, Owen could see immediately that it was a good one. Strickland called while the flatbed was still in the driveway. "I need you to understand," Strickland said. "That machine belonged to my father. He bought it new." "I understand," Owen said. "So if you're going to do something radical with it—" "I'm not going to do anything radical with it," Owen said. "Your father bought that motorcycle because it was the best-handling British twin on the market in 1969. I'm going to make it the best-handling British twin available now. Nothing radical, just correct." There was a pause on the line. "All right," Strickland said. "All right." Owen wasn't taking on more than he could manage. He was careful about that, because he'd seen what happened to small shops that got excited about incoming work and started promising timelines they couldn't keep. He had a notebook. He had a sequence. He worked the jobs in the order they came in, except when a parts delay pushed something back, in which case he shifted to the next machine and documented the interruption so he didn't lose his place. This was not a glamorous system, but it worked, and working systems had more value than glamorous ones. What was changing, and what he hadn't entirely anticipated, was the nature of the attention coming from Del Fontaine's share. Del had a following built around the idea of motorcycles as objects with histories rather than just machines with specs. And the people who followed him were the kind of enthusiasts who read about what they loved rather than just consuming it. They asked Owen questions in the comments that were genuinely technical, and he answered them genuinely, which was apparently unusual enough to generate its own conversation. Within 3 weeks of Del's share, 2 different motorcycle publications had emailed the contact address Owen had reluctantly added to his profile. One was a small enthusiast magazine that wanted to do a feature. The other was a larger industry site that wanted a quote for an article about custom builders. He gave the quote. He declined the feature because a feature felt premature and he didn't have time. He did not tell anyone about the 5 Sinclair motorcycles. Not yet. He wasn't ready to make that part of the story because the story wasn't finished. And he'd learned enough about the way things develop to know that incomplete stories get completed by other people if you're not careful. The 5th machine, the rare one, was finished in April. He documented the entire final assembly on video and posted it in 3 parts over 3 consecutive days. By the end of the 3rd day, the video series had accumulated more views than anything he'd posted before, and the offers to buy the motorcycle had reached a number he was still adjusting to mentally. He sold it to a museum curator in Michigan named Adler, who drove down in a truck on a Saturday morning and spent 2 hours in the garage talking to Owen about the machine's history and provenance before they agreed on a price. Adler looked around the garage before he left. The organized tools, the lift, the 2 clip-on work lights, the shelf of notebooks, the faded calendar on the wall from 2 years ago that Owen kept because the photo on it was a good photograph of a Ducati bevel drive that he liked to look at. "How long have you been in this space?" Adler said. "About 2.5 years in this building, 20 years in the trade. You should have more room." "I know," Owen said. "What's stopping you?" Owen thought about the honest answer, which had several components: money, risk, the specific exhaustion of having built something once and watched it fail, the particular reluctance that comes from having lost more than just a business. He gave the short version. "Working on it," he said. Adler nodded like that was a sufficient answer, and maybe it was. He loaded the motorcycle and drove away, and Owen went back inside the garage and stood for a moment in the space where the 5th machine had been. Both of the last 2 motorcycles were gone now. The Imperial had sold in March to a man named Reyes, who ran a custom shop in New Mexico, and who had sent Owen a 2-paragraph email about the quality of the steering head repair that Owen had printed out and put on the shelf above his workbench. not because he needed the validation, but because it was specific praise for specific work, and that kind of thing was worth keeping. 5 motorcycles, all 5 sold. Owen did the final calculation that evening at the kitchen table after Lily was asleep. The total revenue from all 5 machines, minus the parts and materials he'd invested in each one, minus the hours he'd spent that he could have billed elsewhere, came to a net profit that was larger than his highest earning month at the old shop had ever been. And the old shop had had 2 employees, a lease on a properly zoned commercial property, and the combined effort of him and Maya at their most organized and functional. He looked at that number for a while. He turned off the kitchen light and went to bed, and lay there in the dark, thinking about a leaking garage, and a woman in a conference room who had thought the joke was on him. He fell asleep before he finished the thought. The spring brought more work than he could comfortably handle alone. Not uncomfortably more. He was still managing, still meeting his commitments, but the margins were getting thin. He started waking up at 3:30 instead of 4 to get an extra 30 minutes in the garage before Lily needed breakfast, and he recognized this as either the beginning of a solution or the beginning of a problem, depending on how the next few months went. He hired help in May. The word hired is doing some work there. What he actually did was call a man named Curtis Wade, who had been the best mechanical apprentice at the shop Owen and Maya had run, and who had ended up working at a dealership in the 6 months after the closure, doing warranty work on machines he found boring, doing it badly enough to stay employed, but not badly enough to get fired. Owen had run into Curtis at a parts supplier in April, and they'd had coffee, and Curtis had made 3 observations about a carburetor rebuild Owen was describing that were smart enough that Owen had gone home and thought about the conversation for the rest of the afternoon. "I can't pay you dealership wages," Owen told him on the phone. "Not yet. I can pay you honestly and on time, which is what I can promise." "The dealership pays me dealership wages to be bored," Curtis said. "I'll think about it." He thought about it for 2 days and then called back and said yes. Curtis was 26 and had the quality that Owen most valued in anyone he worked with, which was the willingness to ask questions when he didn't understand something rather than pretending he did. He was also, if anything, fussier than Owen about cleanliness in the workspace, which meant that the garage floor, which Owen kept clean but not obsessively so, became noticeably cleaner within a week of Curtis starting. Owen didn't say anything about this. He found he didn't mind. Having another person in the garage changed the rhythm of the work. Owen had operated alone long enough that he'd forgotten what it was like to have someone to think out loud with. The specific value of saying, "Look at this," to someone who actually looks at it and says something back. Curtis had opinions and wasn't timid about them. And when those opinions were wrong, Owen said so without ceremony. And when they were right, he said that too, which was apparently sufficiently unusual that Curtis mentioned it after about 3 weeks. "My supervisor at the dealership," Curtis said, without looking up from the gearbox he was cleaning, "told me I was wrong about something once, and then later that day he said to someone else that it was his idea." "That's a waste of your time and his," Owen said. "Yeah." Curtis put down the part he was holding and picked up another one. "It was." They worked in silence for a while. The garage had gotten marginally warmer as spring came on, though in the mornings there was still a cold that came up through the concrete floor that no amount of heel shifting addressed. "You know what you're building here, right?" Curtis said. "Like, you know what this actually is?" "A shop," Owen said. "Not just a shop." Curtis looked at him. "My buddy in Denver works for a custom operation that does 6 bikes a year and charges what you should be charging for one. You're not a shop. You're a—" he searched for the word. "You're a destination." Owen thought about that. "I'm a leaking garage in Hallow Creek," he said. "The leak's fixed," Curtis said. "I saw the sealant on the roof." Owen almost smiled. "The point stands." "The point stands for now," Curtis said, and went back to the gearbox. Lily turned 9 in June. Owen made her a cake from a box mix, which was the cake she wanted, specifically because box mix chocolate cake was what her mother had always made for her birthdays. Not because it was better than bakery cake, but because it was the particular taste of a birthday, and some tastes are too precisely associated with a thing to be substituted without loss. Owen had learned this on her 6th birthday when he'd bought a bakery cake and Lily had been fine about it, politely fine, in the way that was worse than if she'd been upset. He sang to her badly and she laughed at it, which was the intended effect. She had a best friend named Tess who had come for the birthday, and a smaller group of kids from her class, and they ran around the backyard with the specific chaotic energy of a 9-year-old social gathering. Owen watched from the porch with a cup of coffee. Curtis, who had shown up with a card and stayed for cake, stood beside him. "She's a good kid," Curtis said. "I know," Owen said. "Looks like her mom in the pictures you have up." Owen looked at his coffee. "Yeah." Curtis didn't say anything else about it. Owen appreciated that. The summer was the summer the channel. He'd started calling it a channel, which felt slightly ridiculous but was accurate, really grew. It wasn't a single moment. It was a series of accumulations, a video that caught traction in a European motorcycle community and brought several hundred new subscribers from Germany and the UK, a comment thread on one of Owen's engineering posts that turned into a weeks-long technical debate involving actual mechanical engineers, and was shared on 3 different professional forums. A short interview that Del Fontaine did on his podcast mentioning Owen's work that ran 8 minutes and brought more traffic than any single thing Owen had posted himself. He had 11,000 subscribers in June. He had 34,000 by August. The inquiries coming through the contact email had grown to the point where Curtis, who dealt with them in the evenings, had suggested they needed a waiting list, and Owen had said he'd think about it, and Curtis had implemented the waiting list anyway and then mentioned it, which Owen decided was acceptable because the alternative, no waiting list, was worse. There were a few things Owen didn't talk about online, and one of them was Vanessa Sinclair. This was a conscious decision. Not bitterness, not strategy exactly, more a sense that the story had a shape he couldn't see the full outline of yet, and that talking about it prematurely would be like describing a machine before you'd finished disassembling it. You didn't know what you had until you could see all the parts. What he did talk about with increasing detail and frequency was the methodology. The idea that a discarded machine had information in it that a new one didn't. Not just mechanical information, but the record of its use, the history of its failures, the evidence of how it had actually been ridden and loaded and treated. That this information, if you could read it, made you a better engineer than you could be starting from scratch. He talked about this in the way he talked about everything, which was directly and without performance, and it connected with people in a way that the performance version probably wouldn't have. A retired structural engineer in Minnesota who had gotten into motorcycles late in life emailed him a 4-page response to one of his posts about frame stress analysis. That was so good, Owen printed it and added it to the shelf above the workbench next to the Rhea's email. A high school automotive teacher in Georgia started using Owen's build documentation in her curriculum and sent him a photograph of her students working on a donated machine using his methodology, which Owen looked at for a long time before responding. In August, Curtis found the announcement online. He brought it up at the end of a workday when they were cleaning up, which was his approach to important things. Wait until the productive work was done, then mention the thing. The Meridian, Curtis said, and Owen knew immediately what he meant. The Meridian Custom Motorcycle Competition was the largest event of its kind in the country. Annual, national, and in the custom motorcycle world, it occupied a position roughly equivalent to what a major film festival occupied in cinema. Not just a competition, but the place where the conversation happened, where the year's work got evaluated against the field. Major manufacturers entered machines built by their custom teams. Independent builders from across the country submitted applications. The judging panel was professional, and the prize was substantial, but the prize wasn't really the point. The point was what winning meant about the work. Entry deadline is September, Curtis said. Results in November. Owen was coiling an extension cord. He finished coiling it. "We'd need to submit which machine?" he said. "That's the question," Curtis said. "The Imperial is gone. The Twin is gone. If we wanted to enter something, we'd need to build something specifically, or..." He paused. "Or we could finish the Fontaine Commission early and submit that." The Fontaine Commission was a machine Dell had eventually, after months of watching Owen's work, asked him to build not a restoration but a wholly original design, which was a different challenge. Owen had agreed partly because the work itself interested him, and partly because he was curious what happened when you brought the same philosophy to something you were building from nothing rather than rebuilding from something. He thought about the competition. He thought about the field, the machines that major manufacturers entered, built by teams with full design facilities and unlimited budgets and engineers who'd gone to schools that Owen hadn't gone to and didn't wish he had. "It's a long shot," Curtis said. "Most things are," Owen said. He hung the extension cord on its hook. He looked around the garage, the lift, the workbench, the tools in their specific places, the notebooks on the shelf, the sign above the door that he could see through the window. "What are the submission requirements?" he said. Curtis had already looked them up. He pulled out his phone and read them. Owen listened. He asked 2 questions. Then he said, "All right, we finish the Fontaine build on the original timeline and submit it. If it doesn't qualify, we don't adjust the timeline. And if it does qualify, then we'll figure out the rest when we get there." Curtis put his phone in his pocket. He had the look of someone deciding whether to say something. "Say it," Owen said. "The Sinclair team enters every year," Curtis said. "They've won the manufacturing division 3 times running." Owen looked at him. "I know," he said. He turned off the shop light. The garage went dark except for the strip of evening light coming under the door. He thought about a conference room, a smile, the specific sound of a laugh from behind a closing door. He kept it there for a moment, looked at it directly the way he looked at a damaged part. Not to dwell, but to see it clearly, to understand what he was actually dealing with. Then he filed it in the same place he'd been filing it for months, and went inside to start dinner. The Fontaine build was going well. Better than well, actually. It was the most demanding thing he'd built, and the demands were making him better. He was solving problems he hadn't encountered before because he hadn't worked at this particular scale and in this particular configuration before, and solving new problems was the only way to add genuinely new knowledge rather than just applying what you already had. He worked on it through August and into September with Curtis, and he documented everything, and the documentation itself became a kind of argument. Not a combative one, but the kind of argument that a good piece of work makes by existing, which is the best kind. The argument was that craft wasn't a compromise between economy and quality, that you could build something rigorous and thoughtful from parts that the market had decided were worth nothing, and what you produced could be worth more than anything the market had originally valued. It was the same argument he'd been making since November, since the drive home from the city with 5 broken motorcycles on a trailer behind him. He just had a better machine to make it with now. The application to the Meridian went in on a Thursday evening in the first week of September. Curtis submitted it while Owen was helping Lily with a book report on a novel about a girl who survived in the wilderness, which was Lily's favorite genre and Owen's least favorite to discuss because the plots always required him to evaluate decisions he found questionable. "She should have built a shelter first," Owen said, "before worrying about the signal fire." "That's not the point of the book, Dad." "What's the point of the book?" "That you can do things you didn't think you could do." He looked at her. She was writing something in the margin of her notes with a green pen, unbothered. "Fair enough," he said. Curtis texted him from across the garage. "Application submitted." Owen looked at the text. He put his phone down. "Okay," Lily said, looking up. "What's the next chapter about?" "I don't know," Owen said. Keep reading." She kept reading. Outside, the September night was cool and clear, and the sign above the garage door, Carter Custom, Restoration and Engineering, was visible from the kitchen window if you looked at the right angle. Owen wasn't looking at it. He was helping his daughter with her homework, but it was there. The confirmation email from the Meridian arrived on a Wednesday morning in October, while Owen was under a machine and Curtis was reading it aloud from across the garage. "Application accepted," Curtis said. "Custom Independent Division, Build Review Panel, November 14th. Award Ceremony, November 15th. He put the phone down on the workbench. "That's 6 weeks." Owen slid out from under the machine. He had grease on his forearm and a cramp in his left shoulder from the angle he'd been working at. He sat up on the creeper and looked at the Fontaine build on the lift. The motorcycle that would be representing Carter Custom at the largest competition in the country in 6 weeks. It looked back at him the way machines look back at you when they're almost done, which is with a kind of patient expectation. 6 weeks is enough, Owen said. To finish, yeah. To finish and dial it in and transport it and set it up for a review panel. That's tighter. Still enough. Curtis made a sound that wasn't quite agreement and went back to what he'd been doing. Owen got up off the creeper and went to the workbench and wrote the dates in the notebook. November 14th, November 15th. He underlined them once. Then he went back to work. The Fontaine build had started as Dell's commission and had become, over the months of its construction, something Owen thought about differently than he'd thought about anything he'd built before. Not because it was showy. He'd made a deliberate decision early on that the machine wouldn't try to be visually dramatic in the way that a lot of competition customs were, with stretched proportions and theatrical chrome and design choices that announced themselves loudly. He wanted it to be the kind of beautiful that required looking at it for a while to fully understand, the kind that got better the more you knew. The frame geometry was his own design, drawn from principles he'd developed across years of rebuilding machines that had failed at specific points and understanding why. The engine was a period-correct unit he'd rebuilt to tolerances he documented down to the thousandth of an inch. The bodywork was minimal in a way that was harder to achieve than maximalism, because minimalism has nowhere to hide its mistakes. Dell had driven down in September to see the progress, and had walked around it for 10 minutes without saying anything, and then said, "I've been writing for 15 years. I don't know what to say about this." "You don't have to say anything," Owen told him. "I want to," Dell said. "I just haven't got the vocabulary for what you've done here." "It goes fast and handles right and nothing falls off," Owen said. "That's the vocabulary." Dell had laughed, and the laugh was genuine, the kind that comes from relief at someone cutting through a thing you've been overcomplicating. Owen liked Dell. He was one of those people whose enthusiasm for the subject had never calcified into ego, which was rarer than it should have been in any community built around loving something. The 6 weeks were not comfortable. Comfortable wasn't the word. Owen was up before 4 every morning, in the garage by 4:15, working until 7 when Lily needed breakfast in the school run, back by 8:30. Curtis arrived at 9 and they worked until 6 or 7 in the evening. Owen went back in after dinner most nights for another 2 or 3 hours. He was sleeping 5, sometimes 4.5 hours, and he knew this was not sustainable past the competition, but the competition was the finish line, and he was capable of running to a finish line he could see. Lily noticed. Of course she noticed. "You look tired," she said on a Thursday morning in October, the kind of flat statement that children make when they've decided to stop protecting your feelings about something. "I am tired," he said. He was making her lunch. He'd forgotten the juice box the day before, and she'd reminded him that evening with the specific diplomatic delicacy of a 9-year-old who knew her father was under pressure but also really wanted her juice box. "Is it the competition thing?" "Yeah." She was quiet for a moment. "Is it important?" He thought about how to answer that honestly without loading her with weight she didn't need to carry. "It could help the business a lot," he said. "So yeah." "Okay," she said. She picked up her backpack. "You should sleep more after." "I will." "You always say that." He handed her the lunch bag. "This time there's a juice box." She checked. There was. She looked up at him with Maya's eyes, which were more specifically Maya's, right now, because she was looking at him the way Maya used to look at him when she was deciding whether to push a point. "I believe you," she said, and went out the door. He stood in the kitchen for a moment after she left. Then he grabbed his coffee and went back to the garage. The machine was finished on November 2nd, 12 days before the review panel. Owen and Curtis spent those 12 days doing what Owen called living with it. Test fits, minor adjustments, a recalibration of the carburation that Curtis identified on day 3, and that took them 2 days to fully resolve. A brake line routing change that Owen decided on during a test ride that was better but required 2 hours of rework. Neither of them called these things problems. They were the conversation that a machine has with you when it's close to done, the last things it has to tell you before it's ready. The test ride was Owen's. He took it out on a Tuesday morning on the county road that ran 4 miles north of town, with no intersections and no traffic at 7:15 a.m., and he ran it up through the gears twice in each direction and came back and put it on the lift and sat on the shop stool and didn't say anything for about 90 seconds. "Well?" Curtis said. "It's right," Owen said. Curtis nodded. "Yeah, I thought so. The throttle response above 4,000. I know. I noticed it too. It's not wrong. It's just different from what I was expecting." "Is different bad?" Owen thought about it. "No, it's actually... No." He got up off the stool. "It's better than what I was expecting." Curtis allowed himself a small, controlled expression of satisfaction that on anyone else would have been a grin. On Curtis, it was a slight relaxation around the eyes. Owen recognized it because he felt the same thing internally, but expressed it roughly the same way. They transported the motorcycle to the Meridian venue, a convention and exhibition center in Indianapolis, on the morning of November 13th, which gave them a day before the review panel and a setup window of 4 hours in the late afternoon. Owen drove. Curtis sat in the passenger seat with the transport documentation on his lap and didn't try to make conversation, which Owen appreciated because he was thinking. He was thinking about the field. He'd looked up the previous year's results and the confirmed entrants for this year. And the independent custom division was genuinely competitive, not in the way that things are described as competitive when they're just slightly harder than average, but in the way that meant the machines being entered had been built by people with serious skill and real commitment. Some of them had been doing this longer than Owen had. One entrant, a builder from Oregon named Sasha Reed, had finished second in the independent division 2 years running and was known for a style of engineering forward design that Owen had a genuine technical respect for. And then there was the manufacturing division, which ran concurrently, different category, different judging panel, but the same floor, the same audience, and the same media coverage. The Sinclair Motorworks team had confirmed their entry in late October. Owen had seen it in an industry newsletter that Curtis forwarded him without comment. The machine was described as a milestone custom engineering project representing the full capabilities of the Sinclair design team. There was a photograph. It was a beautiful machine. No question about that. Owen was not in the habit of lying to himself about quality when he saw it. The Sinclair team had resources and talent, and they used both. He hadn't mentioned any of this to Lily because there was nothing useful to tell her. He hadn't mentioned the Sinclair connection to Curtis because Curtis already knew enough of the background and didn't need Owen to narrate his own feelings about it. He was just driving to Indianapolis with a machine on a trailer behind him that he believed in the way he'd never quite believed in anything he'd built before, and that would have to be sufficient. The convention center was large enough that the first thing you did when you walked in was recalibrate your sense of scale. The main hall had 60-foot ceilings and was divided into sections by manufacturer, by era, by category, and there were machines everywhere, 100, more, in various stages of being positioned and prepped and polished by handlers who treated them with the specific tension of people who had invested enormous effort into something they were about to let be judged. Owen found the independent custom section. Their assigned space was adequate, not a corner, which would have been annoying, and not too close to the main aisle, which would have meant constant foot traffic. He and Curtis set up in a way that was clean and deliberate, with no decorative elements, no signage beyond the required identification placard. Just the motorcycle positioned so that you approached it from a slight angle that showed the frame geometry to best effect, on a simple black mat. The builder from Oregon, Sasha Reed, was 2 spaces over. Owen recognized her from photographs. She was compact and efficient-looking, with the kind of economy of motion that came from years of physical work, and she glanced over at Owen's machine twice while setting up her own, without appearing to. The third time, she walked over. "Carter Custom," she said, looking at the placard. "The Instagram account?" "Yeah," Owen said. "I've been following your work for about 6 months." She looked at the machine directly, the way someone looks at a thing they're actually interested in and not performing interest in. "The steering head on the Imperial repair. I showed that to my partner and we talked about it for an hour." "The crack was bad," Owen said. "The repair had to be better than the original." It was. She was still looking at the motorcycle. "This is yours?" "Del Fontaine commissioned it. It's built to my design." "Del's a good judge." She crouched down and looked at the frame junction at the lower rail without touching it. Then she stood up. "The geometry's unusual. It handles the weight distribution differently than a standard configuration," Owen said. "The mass is centered lower and further back than you'd expect. It took a while to get the trail right. What did you end up at?" He told her. She thought about that for a moment. "That's aggressive," she said. "It wants to be ridden," Owen said. "It's not a showpiece." Something in her expression settled, like a question had been answered. "I've got 12 years on you in this division," she said. "Maybe more. You're going to make this interesting." She went back to her own space. Owen watched her go, then looked at Curtis, who was adjusting the mat underneath the motorcycle with the focus of a man who found the angle of a mat personally important. "That was good," Curtis said, without looking up. "It was a conversation," Owen said. "A good one." Curtis stood up and looked at the mat. "She's right that you're going to make it interesting." "We'll see." "No, I mean—" Curtis turned to look at him. "You already did. Whether you win or not, you already made it interesting." Owen looked at the motorcycle for a moment. "Let's just make sure the lighting angle is right," he said. The review panel on November 14th was 3 judges who moved through the independent custom entries methodically and without visible emotion, which was the correct way to do it. They spent 18 minutes at Owen's space, which Curtis timed on his phone and later told him was the longest stop of the morning in their section. The lead judge, a man named Werner, who had a background in aerospace engineering and had been judging the Meridian for 11 years, asked Owen 4 questions. One about the frame specification, one about the engine rebuild tolerances, one about the brake system, and one about the bodywork material and its joining method. Owen answered all 4 without consulting any notes. Werner made a notation on his clipboard after the 4th answer. He looked at the machine one more time. "Thank you," he said, and they moved on. The award ceremony was the following afternoon. Owen and Curtis were there early, which was Owen's instinct in any situation where he might otherwise be rushed. The hall had been reconfigured for the event. Chairs in rows, a raised platform with a podium, lighting that was warmer and more formal than the exhibition lighting. There were several hundred people. The media presence was larger than Owen had expected, with cameras and at least 3 people he recognized as writers for industry publications. He saw the Sinclair team across the room. There were 8 of them. A lead designer, several engineers, 2 people who appeared to be communications staff. They occupied a group of chairs with the comfortable clustered confidence of a team that had done this before and expected to do well. Owen recognized 2 of them from their photographs in industry materials. He didn't see Vanessa Sinclair, but he hadn't expected to. She was a CEO, not a competition handler. The ceremony moved through categories: classic restoration, vintage racing, manufacturer modified. Each division was announced with a description of the entries and the judges' assessment criteria, and then the results. Owen watched the Sinclair team receive the Manufacturing Division award with a quiet, organized satisfaction that looked like the expression of people confirming what they'd already known. The lead designer shook hands with the presenter and said a few words that were professional and appropriate. Owen clapped with everyone else. The independent custom division was last. The presenter, the event director, a woman named Haas, spent 3 minutes describing what the judges had seen in this year's field, which was, she said, the most technically demanding group of entries in the competition's history. Owen was looking at the floor. He had his hands resting on his knees. Curtis was sitting beside him with his arms crossed, which was Curtis's posture when he was trying to appear less tense than he was. The judges noted exceptional craftsmanship across the division this year, Haas said, and the deliberation was the longest in recent memory. In a year of genuinely strong entries, the panel identified one machine that represented a singular convergence of engineering innovation, construction quality, and a coherent philosophy of design. She looked at her card. The winner of the independent custom division of the Meridian competition is the Fontaine build, submitted by Carter Custom of Hallow Creek. Curtis said something under his breath that Owen didn't catch. Owen stood up. The room was applauding, and he was walking toward the platform, and he was aware of these things in the specific, disconnected way that you're aware of your surroundings when your central processing is occupied with something else, which in this case was the effort of not showing on his face what he was feeling. He shook Haas's hand. He received the award, a physical thing, a cast piece that was heavier than expected. He stood at the podium and looked at the room. "I want to thank Del Fontaine, who commissioned the machine and trusted me with it," he said. "And Curtis Wade, who's the other half of Carter Custom and the reason the carburation is right." He paused. "The machine was built from the idea that what gets thrown away still has something to say. I think it said it." That was all he said. He stepped back from the podium. The applause was genuine, and he received it by looking at the award in his hands and then at Curtis, who was standing and clapping with an expression that was as close to uncontrolled feeling as Owen had ever seen on him. The media came quickly. 3 journalists in the first 10 minutes, 2 of them with cameras. Owen answered their questions directly and without embellishment, which was how he answered all questions. He confirmed the story of the build. He confirmed the methodology. And then, because the third journalist, a woman named Cass from a large circulation industry site, asked specifically about the philosophy behind Carter Custom and where it had started, Owen told her. He didn't tell her the whole story. He told her the relevant part, which was that the foundational machines, the ones that had established his method and funded the first growth of his operation, had been 5 motorcycles given to him as a joke by a major industry manufacturer who had considered them worthless. He said it plainly, without drama, as a matter of fact. He described them accurately. He declined to name the manufacturer at that point because the manufacturer hadn't named themselves. Cass was a good journalist. She understood immediately what she had. "Can you describe the circumstances?" she said. He described them. She wrote for 45 seconds without looking up. The article went live that evening at 7:30. By 9 o'clock, it had been shared across every major motorcycle forum online. By midnight, it had been picked up by 2 general interest news aggregators. The detail that traveled fastest, the specific storybook detail that the internet found irresistible, was the 5 motorcycles, the scrapyard bikes, the gift that was meant to be humiliating and had become foundational. By the next morning, the article had reached people who didn't particularly care about motorcycles, but cared about the shape of the story, which was the shape that a certain kind of story always has when it's true. Small against large, discarded against prized, the joke that goes wrong. Owen found out the scale of it the next morning when Curtis called at 6:15. "Have you seen your phone?" Curtis said. "I just woke up. Your mentions are—" A pause. "I don't have a word for what they are." Owen sat up. Lily was still asleep. He looked at his phone. He had over 2,000 notifications across his accounts, which was not a number his phone had ever displayed before. "Okay," he said. "The Sinclair thing is everywhere," Curtis said. "People figured out the company. I don't know how, maybe from the machine descriptions or the timing, but how are they framing it?" "The way it is," Curtis said, "Billionaire mocks broke mechanic. Broke mechanic wins national competition with the Billionaire's trash." A pause. "I mean, that's not exactly—" "That's the shape of it," Owen said. He got up and went to the kitchen and made coffee. Through the window, the garage was visible in the early light, the sign above the door still there. He held his coffee and looked at it, and thought about the fact that the story was now out of his hands in the way that things become out of your hands when they become other people's. And he thought about whether he was comfortable with that. He was. Not entirely. He'd have told it differently himself, with more technical detail and less narrative arc. But the core of it was accurate, and he'd made a decision long ago, sometime around the second bucket in the leaking garage, that the only version of his own story he was going to be responsible for was the true one. He texted Lily's school to let them know she'd be slightly late because he needed to talk to her before she went in. When she came down for breakfast and he explained what had happened, as simply and accurately as he could without oversimplifying it, she listened with both elbows on the table and her chin in her hands. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment. "So everybody knows now?" she said. "A lot of people." "And the lady who gave you the motorcycles?" "She'll know soon if she doesn't already." Lily thought about that. "Is that okay?" Owen drank his coffee. "Yeah," he said. "I think it is." She considered this with the seriousness she gave to things that mattered. "Good," she said, and reached for her cereal. He was in the garage by 8:30. By 10, the Carter Custom inbox had received more inquiries than the previous 3 months combined. By noon, 2 of the industry publications that had declined to do features on him earlier in the year had emailed requesting interviews. By 2 in the afternoon, Priya Mehta, that name again, the HR coordinator from the Sinclair third-floor conference room, had called the contact number on his website. She hadn't left a message. At 4:15, a different number called. Owen was finishing a repair and let it go to voicemail. He listened to the voicemail 10 minutes later, standing in the garage with grease on both hands. The voice was businesslike and composed, and he recognized it immediately because it was the kind of voice that you remembered. It had changed slightly in a year. Something in the register, something that wasn't quite the same quality of absolute certainty. But it was recognizable. Vanessa Sinclair said that she had seen the coverage and was aware of the circumstances being discussed. She said that she would like to come to Hallow Creek at his convenience to see his operation and speak with him directly. She said she understood if he had no interest in meeting and that this call was not a legal matter and he was under no obligation of any kind. She said she would appreciate a response either way. She left a direct number and ended the call. Owen played it again. Then he put his phone in his pocket and picked up the tool he'd put down and went back to the machine he was working on, and he worked for another 40 minutes without stopping because the machine needed finishing and the machine didn't care about phone calls. When he was done, he washed his hands. He stood at the workbench and looked at the notebook shelf. The Reyes email, the Minnesota engineer's letter, the accumulated record of a year's worth of work done in a leaking garage with a system that had turned out to be worth something after all. He picked up his phone. He found the number Vanessa Sinclair had left. He looked at it for a moment. Then he typed a reply. "I'm available Thursday afternoon. The address is on the website." He sent it. He put the phone down. He went inside to start dinner because it was 6 o'clock and Lily would be home in 20 minutes and she'd eaten school lunch today, which meant she'd be hungry. The phone buzzed once on the workbench behind him. He didn't go back to read it. Whatever she'd said could wait until he'd fed his daughter. Vanessa Sinclair's reply had been 3 words. "Thursday works. Thank you." Owen had read it the next morning, noted the absence of anything he needed to respond to, and gone about his day. He didn't tell Curtis about the meeting until Wednesday afternoon, and he told him the same way he told him most things, flatly, without build-up, while they were both working on something else. "She's coming here?" Curtis said. "Thursday, 4 o'clock. Curtis was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was processing something he had a reaction to but hadn't decided how to express yet. He set down the part he was holding with slightly more deliberateness than the part required. "You want me here or not here?" he said. Owen thought about it. "Here," he said, "but working, not standing around." Understood. They didn't discuss it further. That was one of the things Owen valued about Curtis. He knew the difference between a conversation that needed to go somewhere and one that had already arrived. Thursday morning, Owen cleaned the garage. Not for Vanessa Sinclair. He cleaned it because a clean workspace was a functional one, and because he didn't want to be standing in clutter when he had a conversation that required him to think clearly. He swept the floor, organized the workbench, made sure the notebooks were in their order on the shelf. He looked at the space when he was done, and it looked the way it always looked when it was right. Purposeful, specific, belonging to the work that happened in it. He picked Lily up from school at 3:15 and brought her home and told her he had a meeting at 4 and asked if she could do her homework inside until it was done. "Who's the meeting with?" she said. He told her. She put her backpack down on the kitchen chair and looked at him with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and not quite managing it. "The motorcycle lady?" she said. "Yeah." "The one who laughed?" "She wasn't the only one who laughed," Owen said. "But yes." Lily was quiet. She pulled her homework folder out of her backpack with more focus than a homework folder required. "Okay," she said. "Okay?" "Yeah." She opened the folder. "Just let me know how it goes." He looked at her for a moment. 9 years old, sitting at the kitchen table with her homework, choosing, in the specific way she had of choosing, not to be dramatic about something she clearly had feelings about. He'd seen Maya do the same thing. The deliberate setting aside of reaction in favor of something more useful. It undid him a little, still, when Lily did it. "I will," he said. He went back to the garage. Vanessa Sinclair arrived at 4:03 in a car that was deliberately ordinary. A dark sedan with no markings, not the kind of vehicle you'd associate with a CEO of a company with a 9-figure valuation. Owen noticed this and understood it as a choice. She got out alone. No assistant, no associate in an expensive suit. She was wearing a jacket over a plain sweater and dark pants, and she looked like a person who had thought carefully about not looking like what she usually looked like, which was its own kind of signal. She stood in the driveway and looked at the sign above the garage door. Carter Custom. Restoration and Engineering. She looked at it for a moment longer than a person looks at a sign they're reading rather than considering. Then she walked toward the open garage door, and Owen came out to meet her. They looked at each other. Up close, she looked different than she had in the Sinclair conference room a year ago. Not older, exactly, But something had shifted in the quality of her composure, like a structure that had been stressed and rehardened slightly differently. The absolute certainty was still there, but it had a more careful quality now, as if she was applying it more deliberately. "Mr. Carter," she said. "Ms. Sinclair." He stepped back. "Come in." She came into the garage. Curtis was at the second bench working on a cylinder head, and he looked up and nodded once and looked back down, which was the right call. Owen watched Vanessa take in the space. The systematic way she looked at things, moving from the lift to the tool organization to the shelf of notebooks to the machine currently on the lift, which was a mid-70s Japanese 4 that a collector in Wisconsin had shipped down. She was a person who gathered information from environments, Owen understood. She had that quality. He'd seen it in the conference room and he saw it here. She stopped at the workbench. She looked at the notebooks. "May I?" she said. "Yeah." She picked up the top notebook and opened it to a random page. She read for a moment. She put it down carefully in the same position. "These are build records?" "Engineering logs. Every decision, why it was made, what the alternative was, what the result was." "For every machine?" "Every machine since I started this operation." She looked at the shelf. There were 11 notebooks now. "How many machines?" she said. 31 complete restorations, 14 custom builds, 6 engineering consultations where I assessed someone else's work." She turned to look at the machine on the lift. "And the methodology, what you described in the interview, that came from the 5. It wasn't quite a question. Owen answered it anyway. "The 5 gave me the framework to test it on. The methodology existed before that. I'd been working toward it for a while without naming it." Vanessa nodded. She looked at the machine on the lift, then at Owen. "I owe you an apology," she said. The directness of it surprised him slightly, not because he hadn't expected an apology eventually, but because there was no preamble, no qualification. She just said it, looking at him. "What happened in that conference room was unprofessional," she said. "I was dismissive, and then I was unkind, and then I made it a performance for the people in the room, which was the worst part of it. The motorcycles, the intent behind giving them to you was to humiliate you. I'd like you to know that I'm aware of that." Owen looked at her. He let the silence sit for a moment because he'd learned that silence in the right place was more useful than response. "I know you're aware of it," he said. "Why are you here?" Something in her expression shifted. It was the first time he'd seen her look uncertain, and it lasted only a second before the composure resettled. But it was there. "Because what you built is significant," she said. "Not just the Meridian win, the system, the methodology, the documentation." She gestured at the notebooks. "You built a manufacturing philosophy in a 1,200 square foot garage with no capital and no institutional support. That's not a small operation that got lucky. That's an intellectual framework that could scale." "I know," Owen said. "I'd like to be part of scaling it." The garage was quiet for a moment, except for the faint sound of Curtis doing something careful with a small tool at the other bench. "You want to buy the business?" Owen said. "No." She said it immediately. "I looked at that option. A few people on my team suggested it." A pause. "I don't want to buy your business. I want to build something with you. Equal equity, equal decision authority on the core methodology. I bring capital and infrastructure and national distribution. You bring the system, the brand, and the credibility." Owen looked at her for a long moment. He was doing the specific kind of reading he did on machines, trying to understand what was actually there rather than what he'd already decided was there. "Why equal?" he said. "You could find a mechanic with a good reputation, license the methodology concept, and build something adjacent for a fraction of what equal equity would cost you." "I could," she said, "and it would be worth a fraction of what this would be worth." She wasn't being defensive. She was being accurate, which Owen respected more. The public story of this, Carter Custom, the 5 motorcycles, the Meridian, that's not a brand asset you can replicate or approximate. It's real. The methodology is real. The only version of this that captures the full value is the one that's actually true. And the one that's actually true requires me. Yes. He turned away from her and looked at the machine on the lift. He was thinking about several things simultaneously and trying to give each of them the right amount of weight. He was thinking about the waiting list that was now 14 machines long. He was thinking about the 2 jobs he'd had to decline last month because he and Curtis could not physically do more work without more space. He was thinking about a specific inquiry he'd received 3 weeks ago from a veterans organization in Ohio asking if he did training workshops, which he'd had to say no to, not because he didn't want to, but because there was no capacity. He was also thinking about the conference room, the smile, the sound of the laugh. Not with anger, he'd set that down a long time ago because it wasn't useful, but as information, as data about who this person had been, which was relevant to understanding who she was now. "I want to ask you something," he said, turning back. "Ask," she said. "What did you think when you drove here today, before you got out of the car?" She looked at him steadily. "I thought about all the ways this conversation could go badly," she said. "I thought about whether you'd want to hear anything I had to say. I thought about whether the apology would matter or whether it would just be something I needed to say." A pause. "I also thought you'd probably have a better workspace than I was imagining, which you do." "What were you imagining?" "Something more," she looked for the word, "provisional." "It was more provisional," Owen said. "A year ago." She looked at him. "I know. I should have been here a year ago." He walked to the workbench. He picked up the top notebook, the one she'd looked at, and opened it. He found a specific page, a diagram he'd drawn in February, the framework of a system he'd been thinking about for months. A restoration and training model that moved in parallel, machines coming in for rebuild, people coming in for skill development, both streams producing output that could fund each other. He held it up so she could see it. She looked at it. He watched her read it the way she'd read the notebook page, absorbing it, not performing attention. "I drew that in February," he said. "I've been thinking about the scale question longer than you have." She looked at the diagram for another moment. Then she looked at him. "What do you need to make that real?" "Capital for a larger facility, 2 additional trained mechanics minimum, more within 18 months. Structured training program, distribution infrastructure for machines produced at volume, and complete autonomy over the methodology, how we restore, what we restore, the standards we hold. Define complete autonomy. It means if your production team wants to cut a corner on a rebuild to improve the margin, the answer is no. My name is on the methodology. The methodology doesn't compromise." She nodded. Not the quick nod of someone agreeing to move past a point, the slow nod of someone actually integrating it. "That's acceptable," she said. "It's not a negotiating position," Owen said. "It's a condition." "I understand the difference," she said. And for the first time, something crossed her face that wasn't composure or apology or business calculation. Something simpler and slightly harder to categorize. Something that might have been, in a different person, admiration. "I'd like to discuss terms properly, with attorneys present, documented, nothing informal." "Agreed," Owen said. "I'll have my team contact you to set up a formal meeting." She reached into her jacket pocket and produced a card, an actual physical business card, which felt slightly out of time but also appropriate somehow. She put it on the workbench. "My direct line, not through PR, not through HR, direct." Owen looked at the card. He didn't pick it up. "One more thing," he said. She waited. "The training program, it's not optional. It's not a PR component or a community initiative that gets cut when margins tighten. It's structural. Unemployed mechanics, veterans, people who were where I was and don't have the path out that I found. That's part of the model, or the model doesn't work." Vanessa looked at him for a long moment. In the particular quality of that look, Owen saw something he hadn't seen in their first meeting, a kind of recalibration happening in real time, the adjustment you make when someone keeps turning out to be different from your working assumption of them. "You're not what I expected when you walked into my building," she said. "What did you expect?" "Someone more," she paused, "grateful for the opportunity." "I came to your building because I needed work," Owen said. "I'm talking to you now because the work I did earned it. Those are different things." She picked up her jacket where she'd set it over the edge of the workbench. "The training program is structural," she said. "I'll put it in the term sheet as a founding provision." She walked toward the garage door. At the threshold, she stopped and looked back. Not at Owen, but at the garage itself. The lift, the workbench, the machine in progress, the sign visible through the door. When you drove away from our building last November, she said, with those 5 motorcycles, what were you thinking? Owen considered whether to answer fully. He decided to. I was thinking about which one to start with, he said. She held that for a moment. Then she walked out to her car. Owen stood in the garage after the sound of the engine faded down the street. Curtis set down his tool. She's serious, Curtis said. It wasn't a question. Yeah, Owen said. She is. How do you feel about it? Owen picked up Vanessa's card from the workbench. He looked at it. The name. The direct number. The Sinclair Motorworks logo in the corner, which was clean and well-designed and represented a company that had, for 20 years, occupied the top of a market that Owen was now, in some specific and unignorable way, part of. I feel like I have a lot of work to do, Owen said. He put the card in his shirt pocket and went to the machine on the lift, because there were 2 more hours of daylight and the cylinder head still needed attention. Curtis picked up his tool and went back to work as well, and the garage settled back into the sound it made when things were going right. Metal and concentration and the specific quiet of people who understood what they were doing and why. Lily came to the garage door at 6:15. She stood in the doorway in her socks, which meant she'd forgotten shoes, which was a thing she did when she was trying to get somewhere quickly without going through the full process. Well, she said. Owen looked up from the machine. Well, what? The meeting. How'd it go? He thought about how to answer that accurately and efficiently for a 9-year-old who deserved the truth but didn't need every component of it right now. Good, he said. She looked at him with the full wattage version of Maya's eyes. That's it? Just good. It went well, he said. She apologized. We talked. There might be something bigger happening. He looked at her. I'll tell you more when I know more. She considered this. She looked at Curtis, who was deliberately not involved in this conversation. Did she seem sorry? Lily said. Actually sorry, not just saying it? Owen thought about that, about the quality of the apology, the way it had been given without setup, the absence of justification. The look on Vanessa Sinclair's face when she'd stood at the threshold of the garage and asked what he'd been thinking on the drive home. Yeah, he said. I think she was. Lily leaned against the doorframe. Okay, she said. Then after a moment, she should be. Lily. I'm just saying. I know what you're saying. Go put shoes on. She went back inside. Owen turned back to the machine. Curtis made a sound that was not quite a laugh. She's something, Curtis said. I know, Owen said. He picked up his tool. He thought about term sheets and attorneys and founding provisions and a diagram in a February notebook that had started as a thought experiment and was beginning to look like a blueprint. He thought about a larger facility somewhere, not too far from Hallow Creek, because Lily's school was here and her friends were here, and the rented house with the kitchen window that looked out at the garage was here, and some things you don't move even when everything around them changes. He thought about the veterans organization in Ohio that had asked about training workshops. He was going to be able to say yes to that. He thought about Curtis and what fair equity looked like for someone who'd walked into a leaking garage for honest pay when the business was nothing and had helped make it into something. He was going to have that conversation before any term sheet was signed, because Curtis was part of what Vanessa Sinclair was buying into, and Curtis deserved to know that and to be compensated accordingly. Owen was already certain of this, and had been since the car ride home from Indianapolis. The machine on the lift needed another hour of attention. He gave it that attention completely, the way he gave everything his complete attention when it was in front of him and under his hands. This was the thing that had not changed across everything that had changed. Not the grief, not the failure, not the cold garage and the leaking roof and the 5 wrecks on a trailer and the year of work that had followed. The quality of attention he brought to a machine in front of him was the same as it had always been. It was the most reliable thing he had, and he protected it accordingly. At 8 o'clock, he locked the garage, hung up his apron, washed his hands at the utility sink. He stood for a moment in the driveway and looked at the sign. Carter Custom. It was getting dark and he could still read it. He went inside. Lily was at the kitchen table finishing the last of her homework, her green pen moving steadily across a worksheet. The kitchen smelled like the soup he'd put in the slow cooker that morning, which had been doing its job all day. He served the soup. He sat down across from her. She put the pen down. They ate dinner, and he told her a little more about the meeting. Not all of it, but enough. She listened the way she always listened, with full attention and the specific gravity she gave to things that mattered to her. And when he was done, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "So what happens next?" "A lot of meetings," he said. "A lot of paperwork. And then a lot of work. More work than now. Different work," he said, still the same kind underneath. She thought about that. She picked up her spoon. "That's okay then," she said. He looked at her across the table. The loose ponytail, the green pen behind her ear, the soup bowl she was holding with both hands because she liked the warmth of it. "Yeah," he said. "It is." The attorneys took 6 weeks, which Owen had expected, and the term sheet went through 4 drafts, which he had also expected. And there were 2 meetings where the conversation got genuinely difficult, and one where Owen stood up and said he needed 20 minutes and walked around the block alone in the cold until he could think clearly again. None of this was surprising. Building something real with another person, especially a person with whom your entire history was adversarial, did not resolve itself quickly or cleanly, and Owen was suspicious of anything that tried to. The founding provision about the training program held through all 4 drafts. Owen had made it clear in the first meeting that it was non-negotiable, and Vanessa had made it clear in the same meeting that she'd already told her legal team it was non-negotiable. And after that, it stopped being a point of discussion and became a point of structure, which was where Owen needed it to be. Curtis's equity conversation happened on a Wednesday evening in December, after everyone else had gone and the garage was quiet. Owen had been thinking about how to approach it for 2 weeks, and had decided that the right approach was direct and specific, which was the only approach he actually knew. "When this partnership closes," Owen said, "you're getting 8% of Carter Customs' founding equity. That's already in the structure. I wanted you to hear it from me before the attorneys sent anything." Curtis was cleaning a carburetor at the bench. He set it down. 8% of what it is now, or what it becomes, he said, "of the entity, which will grow. The 8% grows with it." Curtis looked at the carburetor for a moment without seeing it. Owen could see him running the maths, not just the number, but the meaning of the number, which was larger than the percentage, and both of them knew it. "You didn't have to do that," Curtis said. "I know," Owen said. "That's not why I'm doing it." Curtis picked the carburetor back up. He looked at it properly this time. "Okay," he said. "Okay?" "Yeah." A pause. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Just keep doing the work." "Obviously," Curtis said, and that was the end of the conversation, which was exactly the right length for what it needed to be. The partnership between Carter Custom and Sinclair Motor Works closed on a Tuesday in January under a name that had taken 3 weeks to agree on, Meridian Craftworks. Not Sinclair Custom, not Carter Sinclair, not any of the 12 other suggestions that had come from Vanessa's communications team. Owen had proposed Meridian because the competition was where the story had become public, and because Meridian meant the highest point, and because it was a word that belonged to neither of them individually. Vanessa had agreed without negotiation, which Owen had taken as a sign that she understood what the name was doing. The first facility opened 8 months later in a converted industrial building 12 miles from Hallow Creek, close enough that Owen could manage both locations without Lily changing schools, which had been a condition he'd stated early and clearly. The building had been a small appliance manufacturer in a previous life and had the bones that serious mechanical work required: high ceilings, heavy electrical, a loading dock, a concrete floor that could take the weight of a lift. Owen had walked through it twice before agreeing, and both times he'd been looking at the infrastructure rather than the cosmetics, which needed significant attention but were not, ultimately, the point. The cosmetics got attention anyway. Not from Owen, from a designer that Vanessa brought in, a practical woman named Ruth, who had the good sense to ask Owen what the space needed to do before she decided what it needed to look like. The result was functional and clean and not trying to be anything other than a serious workshop, which was the correct aesthetic for a serious workshop. There was a glass-walled training room along one side of the main floor, which had been Owen's design requirement. He wanted the training program visible from the production floor and the production floor visible from the training room, because he believed, and could not entirely explain why he believed, that seeing both happening simultaneously was important to understanding what the work actually was. The training program launched in the third month of the facility's operation with 11 students. 8 of them veterans referred through the Ohio organization that had contacted Owen a year earlier. 3 of them unemployed mechanics from the surrounding county who'd heard about the program through a notice Owen had posted at 2 parts suppliers and a diner in town. The curriculum was Owen's, built from the engineering logs in those 11 notebooks, structured over 16 weeks and covering both technical restoration methodology and the diagnostic philosophy that underlay it. The idea that a broken thing had information in it, the idea that understanding failure was the beginning of understanding function. Owen taught the first cohort himself, 3 mornings a week, with Curtis handling the production floor in his absence. He was not, by his own assessment, a natural teacher. He was impatient with imprecision and had to work to remember that people needed to arrive at understanding in their own sequence, which was not always his sequence. A veteran named Raymond, who was 43 and had been a vehicle mechanic in the service and had come to the program with significant technical knowledge and zero confidence in his own judgment, taught Owen this in the 4th week when he said, carefully, "You keep telling me what the answer is. I need to figure out how to find the answer." Owen had stopped talking for a moment. Then he said, "You're right. Show me what you see when you look at that carburetor." Raymond showed him. Owen shut up and listened. What Raymond saw was not in the wrong order. It was in a different order, one that prioritized different signals. And when Owen understood this, he could see that Raymond's order had a logic to it that was specific to how Raymond's diagnostic mind worked, and that the outcome, the correct identification of the problem, was the same. After that, Owen taught differently, not worse or better, differently, more like asking questions and less like providing answers. It was harder, and it produced better mechanics, and he filed this knowledge in the same place he filed everything he learned from the work, immediately and permanently. By the end of the first year of Meridian Craft Works, the waiting list for restorations had grown to 62 machines. They had expanded the production team to 9, 4 of whom had come from the training program's first 2 cohorts. Curtis had been promoted, his own term for it, which Owen had found slightly amusing since there was no formal hierarchy to be promoted within, but Curtis had explained that the title of operations lead was accurate and also useful when dealing with vendors, and Owen could not argue with either point. Vanessa came to the facility roughly once a month. These visits were working visits. She moved through the space with the information-gathering attention Owen had noticed in the garage, asked specific questions, sat in on portions of the training program, and then met with Owen for an hour in the glass-walled room to discuss what she'd observed and what the data was showing about the business's trajectory. These meetings were not always comfortable. They had disagreed about pricing strategy twice, and about expansion pace once, and about a proposed licensing deal with a European distributor that Vanessa thought was ready and Owen thought needed another 6 months of evaluation. The licensing deal had been tabled. Owen wasn't certain he'd been right about that. He was certain that the disagreement had been real and that the resolution had come from listening rather than from either of them winning. She had never apologized again after the first time in the garage. Owen had noticed this and respected it. One apology, given properly, was sufficient. Continuing to apologize was a way of centering your own discomfort rather than demonstrating actual change, and what Vanessa had demonstrated over the past 2 years was actual change, not in who she was fundamentally, but in how she applied what she was. The absolute certainty had not gone away. It had been recalibrated against a larger set of information, and the result was someone who was still formidable, but was formidable in a way that made room for other people to be formidable too. Owen did not think of her as a friend. He didn't think of her as an adversary. He thought of her as a partner, which was a category that required more from both people than either of the other two, and was consequently more valuable than either. Lily turned 13 the summer that Meridian Craft Works was named the country's fastest-growing specialty manufacturing brand by an industry publication that had, 2 years earlier, declined to do a feature on Carter Custom. Owen put the magazine on the kitchen table, and Lily looked at the cover without commenting on the irony, which meant she had noticed it. "You look good in the photo," she said. "It's a fine photo," Owen said. He looked at it. He was standing in front of the facility with Curtis and Vanessa on either side, and 2 of the training program graduates slightly behind, And the photograph had caught something true about all of them, which was that none of them looked like they were posing. They were all looking at something outside the frame, which Owen remembered was because Ruth had called out to them from that direction about a second before the photographer shot it. "The article's good," Lily said, reading. "It's accurate. It says you turned down 4 acquisition offers." "I did." She looked up. "Why?" He thought about how to answer that in a way that was honest without being a lecture. Because an acquisition would have meant handing the methodology to people whose primary interest was the return on the acquisition. And the methodology isn't built for that kind of management. She thought about this. "So you said no to a lot of money." "I said no to money that would have cost more than it was worth." She looked at the magazine again, looked at the photo. "Mom would have understood that," she said. He looked at her. She was still looking at the magazine, and her expression was the expression of someone saying a true thing simply without needing it to mean more than it meant. "Yeah," he said. "She would have." Lily put the magazine down and went to get breakfast, and Owen sat at the table for a moment with his coffee and let himself think about Maya, which he still did every day and which still cost him something, though the cost had changed in character over the years. Less acute, more like the weight of something permanent that you'd learn to carry in a way that didn't stop you from moving. He got up and made eggs. The Innovation Campus had been Vanessa's idea, architecturally, but the concept behind it had been Owen's, a thing he'd described in a meeting in the second year as the full version of what we're doing, if we do it right and don't rush. What he'd described was a facility that combined production, training, research, and public education in one space. A place where someone could come to see a machine being restored alongside someone learning how to restore machines, alongside an engineer working on the next iteration of the methodology, alongside a visitor who'd come because they were curious about what craft actually looked like when it was taken seriously. All of it visible. None of it performed. The campus took 3 years to build from that conversation to opening day. There were permit delays and a structural issue with the original site that required moving to a different property, and 2 budget conversations that were genuinely stressful for reasons that had nothing to do with the money and everything to do with the scale of what they were attempting. Owen had moments during those 3 years where the whole thing felt overextended, where he would stand in the original Hallow Creek facility late at night, looking at the machine on the lift, and think about how clean and manageable everything had been when it was just him in a leaking garage and 5 broken motorcycles. He didn't romanticize those days. They had been hard in ways that weren't good, and the hardness hadn't been character building so much as survival grade, and he wasn't interested in pretending otherwise. But there had been something in the scale of that period that he wanted to not lose, the directness of the relationship between the work and the result. He talked about this with Vanessa in one of their monthly meetings, expecting her to redirect toward the operational priorities, and was surprised when she was quiet for a moment and then said, "That's exactly why the production floor of the campus has to be real production, not a demonstration. If it becomes a display, we've lost it." He'd looked at her. "I know," she said, reading his expression. "I'm learning." "You already knew it," he said. "You just named it late." She'd almost smiled at that. Almost. The campus opening was on a Thursday in September, 4.5 years after Owen Carter had driven his truck into the city with a folder of photographs and a grease stain on his shirt. Lily was 13 now and wore her hair differently, down instead of in a ponytail, which had happened gradually over the past year and still surprised him sometimes when he looked at her from a certain angle. She was taller. She was developing opinions about things Owen hadn't known she was paying attention to, which included motorcycle engineering, a subject she had apparently been absorbing through proximity for years, and had recently decided she wanted to understand properly. She had asked Curtis to explain combustion cycles to her in June, and Curtis had done so, and they had ended up spending 3 hours in the garage that afternoon, which Owen had observed from a careful distance with a feeling he didn't entirely have a name for. She was standing beside him now at the entrance of the campus, in the atrium with the high glass ceiling that let in the September light, looking at the 5 motorcycles in the display case against the far wall. They were exactly as they had looked on the day Vanessa handed them over. Owen had made sure of this, which had required some documentation. He'd taken photographs in those early weeks that he hadn't known would matter, and those photographs had guided the preservation. The rust was there. The corrosion was there. The cracked steering head on the Imperial was there. The fifth machine's accumulated grime was there, or a preservation-grade version of it that was indistinguishable to anyone who hadn't lived with the original. They were not beautiful. They were exactly what they had been. 5 machines that a room full of people had laughed at, mounted on a low platform in the entrance of a campus that had cost more to build than Owen's original shop had made in its entire operating life. The bronze plaque beneath them read, "Every great empire begins with something the world was ready to throw away." Vanessa was standing on Owen's other side. She had been looking at the display case since they walked in, with an expression Owen had learned over 4 years to read as genuine feeling that she was managing rather than suppressing. She was not a person who performed emotion, which meant that when you saw it on her face, it was real. The atrium was filling with people. The campus staff, the training program graduates, several of whom had become full-time Meridian employees, industry press, a few of the people Owen had built relationships with over the years, including Sasha Reed from the Meridian competition, who had sent him a handwritten note after the award announcement that said simply, "Good, you should have won." Adele Fontaine was there with the machine Owen had built for him, which he'd brought on its own trailer as a kind of gesture that Owen had found unexpectedly moving. Raymond, the veteran who had taught Owen to teach differently, was there with his wife and his 2 kids, the older of whom was 14, and had apparently developed an interest in machines that Raymond said was entirely Owen's fault. The speeches were short. Owen had been firm about this in the planning. He told Vanessa and the event coordinator both, separately, that if the speeches ran past 20 minutes total, he would leave, which was not entirely true, but was true enough to function as a constraint. Vanessa spoke first, for 6 minutes. She spoke about what Meridian Craftworks had become and what the campus represented, and she did something that Owen had not expected, which was that she told the whole story of the 5 motorcycles from her own perspective. Clearly, without softening the part that didn't flatter her, without using language that redirected the moral of it. She said that she had handed those machines over as a dismissal, not a gift, and that the most clarifying professional experience of her life had been watching what Owen built from her dismissal and understanding over the 2 years of their partnership, what that said about the difference between seeing value and assuming you already know what's valuable. The room was quiet while she said this. Not the polite quiet of people waiting for a speech to end. The other kind. Owen spoke for 4 minutes. He talked about the training program and the people it had graduated. He named several of them, including Raymond, who looked at the ground when his name was said and then looked up. And he talked about what the campus was for, which was the same thing the original Hallow Creek Garage had been for, understanding that a broken thing had information in it that a new thing didn't, and that the information was worth having, and that the people willing to do the work of extracting it deserved the support and the infrastructure and the respect that that kind of work actually required. He did not talk about the past in general terms. He talked about specific things, specific machines, specific people, specific moments where the work had been right. He'd learned from years of teaching and from years of talking to people who cared about what he was doing that the specific was always more powerful than the general, and that the general was often where the truth went to become comfortable and therefore useless. He thanked Curtis, who was in the second row with an expression of focused blankness that meant he was working very hard not to show how he felt. He thanked Lily, who was in the third row and did not work hard to hide how she felt, which meant that when he said her name, she looked at him with wide, direct eyes and her mother's face, and he had to look back at the room for a moment before he could continue. He did not make it sentimental. He didn't need to. The facts were sentimental enough on their own. After the speeches, the campus opened for tours. Owen walked through it with Lily, which felt important, moving through the space with the person who had reminded him, on the drive home from the city with 5 wrecked bikes on a trailer, that people laugh at things they don't understand. The production floor was active, which was how Owen had insisted it be during the opening, not shut down for the event, but running, with 3 machines in various stages of restoration and 2 members of the current training cohort working on them with their assigned mentors. He'd made this case to Vanessa's events coordinator with the same firmness he'd made every other non-negotiable point. The opening was a representation of what the campus was, not a representation of what it looked like when nobody was working. A working floor was the point. Lily stopped at the training room window and looked through the glass at the cohort in session. A Tuesday training day, not paused for the event. 8 people around our table with a disassembled engine between them and a mentor walking them through the diagnostic sequence. She watched for a moment without saying anything. "That could be anybody," she said. "That's the idea," Owen said. She turned from the window. She had her arms crossed in the way she crossed them when she was thinking seriously, which she'd done since she was 8, and would probably do until she was 80. "When I'm old enough," she said, "I want to do the training program." He looked at her. "You're already doing it. I mean formally, as a student. You'd have to apply like everyone else." She raised an eyebrow. "Really?" "No," he said, "but you'd have to do the work like everyone else." "Obviously," she said, and uncrossed her arms, and they walked on. Vanessa found him near the end of the tour, in the back section of the campus where the research area was. A smaller, quieter space with a different character than the production floor, more like a laboratory than a workshop. She came to stand beside him, and they both looked at the current project on the research bench, which was a frame geometry experiment that one of Owen's senior mechanics had been developing for 6 months. "How does it feel?" Vanessa said. He thought about what the honest answer was. "Like there's more to do," he said. She nodded. "That's probably the right answer. How does it feel to you?" She was quiet for a moment. This was one of the things that had changed between them over 4 years. She didn't answer quickly anymore, at least not with him. She gave the question the time it deserved. "Like I almost missed it," she said. "Like I almost made a different decision entirely, and none of this exists." He looked at her. "The day you called," she said, "after the Meridian. When my team was telling me we needed to respond to the media story, there were about 6 different ways I could have gone. I could have issued a PR statement and let the legal team handle the optics. I could have bought you out before you had any leverage. I could have—" She stopped. "I almost didn't call." "What made you call?" he said. She turned slightly to look at the 5 motorcycles in the display case, visible through the atrium glass from where they were standing. "I watched that video of yours," she said, "the one from the first winter, the British twin running for the first time. And I thought, I know where that machine came from, and I understood that I had been the punchline of something I'd tried to make someone else the punchline of." A pause. "That was uncomfortable." "Yeah," Owen said. "I imagine it was." "I don't enjoy being wrong," she said. "Nobody does." "I especially don't," she said, and there was something in her voice that was almost dry humor, almost self-aware comedy about her own nature, and Owen thought that this was probably the version of Vanessa Sinclair that the people who knew her well were familiar with. He didn't know her well exactly, but he knew her better than he'd known her when she was standing in that conference room with a smile that was the wrong kind. "You weren't only wrong," Owen said. She looked at him. "You gave me 5 motorcycles," he said, "whether you meant to or not. You set the whole thing in motion." He paused. "I'm not saying that makes the way you did it acceptable. It doesn't, but the outcome wouldn't exist without the action." She looked at the display case again. "Is that supposed to make me feel better?" "It's supposed to be accurate," Owen said. "What you do with it is up to you." She was quiet. Then, in a tone that was so understated it almost disappeared, "Thank you for taking my call." "You left a good message," he said. She almost smiled again. This time it was closer than usual to being a real one. They stood there for another moment in the quieter part of the campus, while the opening event moved on without them, and the machines in the display case caught the afternoon light through the atrium glass, and the training cohort continued their session behind the glass wall, and the production floor kept its sound going. A specific, purposeful sound that Owen had been hearing in various forms for 20 years, and that still, when he was quiet enough, felt like something. Curtis appeared in the hallway behind them, coat on, clearly about to leave. "I'm heading out," he said. "Good day?" "Yeah," Owen said. Curtis looked at the display case on his way past. He stopped for a half-second, then he walked on without saying anything, which meant he'd said everything that needed saying by stopping. Owen watched him go. Then he went back to find Lily. She was in the atrium, sitting on a bench near the 5 motorcycle display, talking to Raymond's 14-year-old, who had apparently found her despite never having met before, and they were deep in a conversation that Owen caught the tail end of as he approached. Something about the difference between a frame repair that works mechanically and one that works mechanically and holds up to real use, which was a distinction Owen had made in a teaching session that Raymond's kid had apparently been told about secondhand and wanted to understand more precisely. Owen sat down on the other end of the bench and listened. Lily was explaining it well. She was using her hands the way he used his hands when he was describing something spatial, which was his gesture and not Maya's, and he was not prepared for the specific weight of seeing that, the way it felt to watch his child carry something forward without knowing she'd picked it up. He didn't interrupt. He sat and listened, and Raymond's kid asked a good follow-up question, and Lily answered it, and the 5 broken motorcycles stood preserved in their display case 6 feet away, exactly as they had looked on the day they'd been given away as a joke, and the bronze plaque caught the late afternoon light and held it. He thought about what he'd said in the speech, the specific things, the specific people, the specific work. He thought about the drive home from the city on a November evening 4.5 years ago, with the coat hanger exhaust and the low tire and the heater that didn't work, and Lily's son drawing on the fogged-up window and 5 destroyed machines on a trailer behind him. He thought about 4 a.m. in a leaking garage, the trouble light on its cord, the notebook open to the first blank page, the decision to understand what was actually there rather than what he'd already decided was there. He thought about Maya, about what she would have made of this room, this building, this day. He didn't pretend to know the answer exactly. He'd made peace long ago with the fact that grief doesn't resolve, it just changes shape. But he had a sense of it. She would have been practical about it first, wanting to know the numbers and the structure and whether the foundation was solid. And then she would have looked at Lily on that bench talking to a kid she'd just met about frame repair tolerances, and whatever she would have felt about that, Owen felt it now, in her absence, on her behalf. It wasn't happiness, exactly. It was something larger and less comfortable than happiness, something that had more in it, more past, more loss, more pride, more awareness of everything it had cost to arrive at this particular afternoon. It was the feeling of a life that had been broken into pieces and rebuilt into something that didn't look like what it started as, but was, in the ways that mattered, correct. He sat on the bench until Lily finished her explanation, and Raymond's kid said thank you with the sincerity of someone who'd actually gotten what they came for. And then he stood up and told Lily they should probably say their goodbyes before the caterers started breaking down the atrium, and she stood up and straightened her jacket and looked at him. "Good day," she said. "Yeah," he said, "a good day." They walked through the atrium together, past the display case with the 5 bikes and the plaque, and the light coming through the glass ceiling, and Owen didn't stop to look at the motorcycles again because he didn't need to. He knew what they were. He'd known since the night he'd gotten home with them, when he'd gone out to the garage after Lily was asleep, and turned on every light he had, and opened his notebook to the first blank page. They weren't junk. They never had been. They were 5 machines that someone with power and certainty had looked at and decided weren't worth her time. And she had been wrong about them in the way that people are wrong when they confuse what something is with what it costs, when they confuse value with price, when they look at a broken thing and see only the breaking. Owen had looked at the same 5 machines and seen something different. Not potential, exactly. Potential was too optimistic a word for what he did, which was always grounded in the actual condition of the actual thing in front of him. He had seen information. He had seen a record of what these machines had been and what had happened to them and what remained worth saving. And he had understood, in the cold of a November garage with a leaking roof and a daughter asleep inside and bills on the kitchen table and nothing much left to lose, that working with what was real was always more honest than waiting for something better to arrive. That was the thing he'd built the business on, the training program on, the campus on, not the 5 motorcycles. Not the Meridian win, or the partnership, or the magazine covers, or the 47 people who now worked for Meridian Craft Works in some capacity. All of that was outcome. The thing underneath it, the load-bearing thing, was the decision to see what was actually there and do the work that the scene required. He didn't know if success was the right word for what his life had become. It was a more complicated word than people usually meant when they used it. He had lost things that no success replaced. He had built things that the losses made possible. He had helped people he couldn't have helped if he hadn't first been the kind of person who needed help. And that was not a comfort exactly, but it was something, a continuity, a thread between the different versions of the same life. He held the door for Lily as they walked out into the September afternoon. The parking lot was full. The sky had gone to the particular blue of a late summer evening, the light at a low angle that made everything look considered. He could hear faintly the production floor still running inside. "What do you want for dinner?" he said. She thought about it. "That soup from the slow cooker," she said. "The one you made when the Vanessa thing was happening." "That was years ago." "I know. I still think about it." She looked up at him. "Make that." He looked at her. 13 years old. Maya's eyes. His stubbornness. That third quality that was entirely her own. "Okay, Mo," he said. They got in the truck. A different truck than the one he'd driven to the city 4.5 years ago. One with a heater that worked and an exhaust system that was bolted on properly. He started it and pulled out of the parking lot. "Dad," Lily said. "Yeah. Those motorcycles, the ones in the case." She was looking out the window. "They looked exactly like they did that day, right? The day you brought them home?" "Yeah." She was quiet for a moment. "It's good that you kept them that way," she said. "It's good that you didn't fix them." He thought about that. About the version of himself that had cleaned them down and restored them and erased the record of what they'd been. About how much would have been lost in that erasure. "Some things are worth more broken," he said. She turned from the window and looked at him with the expression she had when something landed for her. Not surprise, exactly, but recognition, like something she'd half known for a long time had just been said out loud. "Yeah," she said. "I think so too." They drove toward Hallow Creek in the September evening light, and the campus grew smaller in the mirrors and the road opened up ahead of them, and Owen thought about dinner and about the work waiting tomorrow, and about the cohort in the training room who would be back Thursday, and about Curtis's 8%, and about Raymond's kid asking Lily about frame repair, and about all the ways a thing can be rebuilt into something truer than it started as. He thought about a leaking garage and a bucket and a second bucket 6 inches to the left, and a sign cut from sheet aluminum, and a notebook open to the first blank page at 4 in the morning. He thought about 5 broken motorcycles. He drove home.